Hi, everyone. My name is Therese Lindström, and I am responsible for migration and integration here at the think tank CEAS. I am so happy that you can join us today for this lunch webinar where we are launching a new study. This project and the study has been co-financed by ELF, the European Liberal Forum. And before I go into what we're going to talk about today, I therefore hand over the word to Mr. Marco Mariani from ELF. Marco, are you with us?
Yes, even my camera has been stopped. Anyway, maybe you can just hear me, but it's okay. Good afternoon.
Yes,
and
we hear you.
Welcome to this webinar promoted by European Liberal Forum with the support of Forest. First of all, thank you for taking time out and being here today. My name is Marco Mariani, and I'm member of the board of the European Liberal Forum. For those who do not know us yet, we are a political foundation and the think tank of the ALDE party. The ALDE party is the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. And we are working across Europe together with 47 member association. And I have to say that Forest is a very proactive one. Today we are going to talk about migration and asylum issues and set the basis for liberal discussions on this important topic. We liberals believe in individuals, in human rights, in the rule of law. So I think we have a lot to say on such a topic. In my country, Italy, this is a very important subject, and I have to say that the lack of an effective common response from the European Union was essential to trigger populist and sovereignist movement, and unfortunately racist movement as well. I had just the chance to give a quick look to the study. Anyway, I congratulate with Forest, with the author Bert Parusel, and with the editor Therese Lindström for such an excellent job. So I pass the floor back to the moderator. Thank you for again, and enjoy the webinar.
Need and sustainable European migration system is more urgent now than ever. But at the same time, the differences in political views and wills of migration and asylum is more evident also than ever. In September of this year, the Commission presented a proposal for a new pact on migration and asylum, and it is now being negotiated. The proposal is probably the most holistic attempt ever the Commission has ever made to address Europe's migration opportunities and challenges. It tries to integrate the interlinkage between different migration policy areas and between the internal and external dimensions of migration. The question is, however, will this be the future of a true European system, or will the member states continue to struggle to reach consensus regarding responsibility sharing? I am very honored today to present a study, Pieces of the Puzzle, Migration in the EU. It is written by Bernd Parusel, who is with me today. Bernd is a migration and asylum expert and with a PhD in political science and many years of experience in migration. And we published this study in hope of contributing to a factually anchored account on the current situation and also how we can reach a sustainable and humane European asylum system in the future. Thank you so much, Bernd, for writing the study, and thank you for joining me here today.
Okay, hello everybody, also from my side, and many thanks, Therese, for the kind introduction. You already mentioned the political context that we're in with the new commission's, the commission's new pact on migration and asylum and the negotiations that are going on. And you also mentioned already the purposes of the study. We also, I think, want to introduce new audiences to this topic, introduce people to this topic that haven't perhaps been able to find the information they need in accordance to international conventions. What are the origins of European cooperation over asylum and migration, and how has the Common European Asylum System developed over time? And we also provide a situational update on trying to characterize the situation of asylum at the moment, 5 years after the so-called refugee crisis in Europe. And we're taking a brief look on the proposals that are at the table. So I think then the main analytical part of the that we are dealing with today in Europe, the three key issues concerning the CEAS and their consequences. And I'd briefly like to mention these three. The first one is that there's a lack of legal entry pathways to the EU for people seeking protection, and that pushes them towards irregular and dangerous routes, and also creates sometimes migration situation. And mixed migration means that both refugees and other migrants are traveling on the same routes, and that is a situation that is not easy to but the essential problem behind that is that there are no legal entry pathways, basically. The second problem we identify is that despite clear commitments actually in the treaties of the European Union to solidarity among the member states, the EU still has no system that guarantees a fair sharing of responsibilities among the member states. Responsibilities that arise from the arrival across the member states is volatile and very unbalanced, where some countries take relatively many asylum seekers and other solidarity issues. It rather aggravates the problem. And the consequence of that is it's a very serious one, because this situation with unbalanced responsibility sharing triggers, or at least incentivizes, a race to the bottom among the member states when it comes to national asylum standards, because those countries that receive relatively many and receive little help have incentives to, for example, resort to deterrent strategies, lower implementing more restrictive policies. So if responsibilities, and also a very basic one actually, is that there's a lack of fairness in Europe towards asylum, and mainly also the chances of actually receiving protection vary a lot from one country to another, depending on where in the EU an asylum application is made. So here the problem is that some nationalities are frequently being recognized as being in need of protection in some member states, but not in others. And we provide some examples and then statistical analysis on this in the book. One example where this is very clear is Afghanistan as a country of origin. Then the CEAS also faces other problems, of course, but we're dealing with them a little bit more briefly in the book. But there are differences in national asylum procedures and also reception conditions for asylum seekers. There are difficulties regarding the prevention of irregular migration. Also, in cooperation with non-EU countries, there are moral and practical difficulties here. We have problems relating to limited competencies and capabilities of EU-level institutions, such as the European Asylum Support Office, the EASO. And we also have problems regarding the return of irregular migrants and rejected asylum seekers to their countries of origin. So I think now the big question, of course, that we're asking is, will these problems be solved and can they be solved? I think our answer is, well, whether they will, it's not, we can't be sure, because it's a lot a matter of the issue of responsibility sharing for asylum seekers. Here we have some pessimistic scenarios, which is, for example, the status quo scenario, or a scenario where we see a renationalization of asylum policies in the EU, where each country tries to find their own solution and depart from the common system. So that's the pessimistic scenario. But we also have more optimistic and ambitious scenarios, for example, a system with fair quotas, where each member state takes in asylum seekers in accordance to or based on a fair distribution key, And also another optimistic proposal would be a scenario of free choice, where asylum seekers get greater possibilities to themselves make choices where to go. But those ambitious scenarios are perhaps not necessarily realistic. And what we see right now in the Commission's pact is there are somewhere flexible solidarity, where it is proposed that asylum seekers should be relocated among member states, but member states who don't want to do this also get the possibility to, for example, provide support in other ways by return sponsorship, for example, or by providing capacity building resources. So our argument, however, is that we should be more ambitious than that, because that interim solution based on flexible solidarity creates problems as well. It will certainly lead to a debate all the time about whether or not each member state is doing enough really, or whether they should do more. There can be debates both within and among the member states, and it's not necessarily a good thing to keep this issue in the headlines in that way all the time. When it comes to legal pathways, the other point. For other migrants, I think that is important as well. I mentioned the mixed migration situation before, but family reunification opportunities play an important role to enable legal migration, but also possibilities for people to come for work opportunities if there's a demand for labor in Europe, and also providing, for example, visas or residence permits for study or education opportunities in Europe. I think one thing we have to be clear about regarding this point is that we don't really know to what extent those legal pathways will reduce irregular migration pressures. There's no real proof of such a connection, but I think we have to try to develop alternatives to irregular pathways and try to establish this alternative and then see to what extent it will work. Lastly, on the three topics, the approximation of asylum procedures and decision-making. We have already some experiences in Europe with joint asylum processing exercises, common country of origin information, experts workshop, all this with the ambition to have a more harmonized approach to decision-making on asylum cases. But I think it's now time to move from just learning and exchanging experiences to also providing more guidance and more monitoring member states' decision-making practice. How are we going to proceed from here? That's now, of course, a political question. We need a new comprehensive reform like the new pact proposed by the Commission, or would it have been better to proceed step by step and focus on consolidating the already existing rules and ensuring member states' compliance with the systems that we already have? I think in the current situation, where many member states are very unhappy with the situation, there is perhaps no other political choice than to move forward with a comprehensive grand reform. But I think we have to keep in mind during this process that the more complex, the more bureaucratic and the more complicated a new system becomes, the harder it will also be to make it work. And also, what happens if a minority of member states again attempts to block a common solution? We have seen this problem before and struggled with it for a long time. And I think perhaps we should start contemplating also the idea of a common European asylum system with different speeds. This is not obviously the best solution, but if there's a majority of sufficiently large and sufficiently many member states that would join forces and make progress and adopt a more a fairer system with better responsibility sharing, perhaps some skeptics could be left out. They would have then, the skeptics would have their own, would have certain freedoms to pursue their own choices on the basis of the existing conventions and legislation that we have. But if they don't join with the core group, then they would also miss out on mutual assistance, help in crisis situation, and certain financing instruments and so on. So that is something to consider, I think. And lastly, one of the most important aspects, however, and an overarching aspect, I think that we need a new vision for asylum and migration in the EU, a narrative about the EU wants to do and what it can do. Will it try to deter migrants and become a fortress, or will it try to manage migration responsibly, realistically, and protect people who need protection? So in this context, we also have to consider the EU's role in the world, because what we have right now is also seen from abroad, and if we want good policies for refugee protection in other regions of the world, then we have to be a good example ourselves. So finally, I would like to thank FORES and ALF for running and financing this project. I have received a lot of help and assistance along the way. Not least, I also want to thank the 3 anonymous reviewers that have read the book and provided very good comments that helped me a lot. And I hope that this publication will do some good for the further development of asylum and migration policy in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure it will. And of course, it's a lot more information in the book. It's hard to summarize in such a short time, I know. And for those of you who are interested in reading the book, you can order it at fores.se, where there's also an online version, so you could also view it immediately from our webpage. We also published today a policy brief that you also wrote, where you elaborate a little bit on the recommendations. You mentioned most of them now, but that can also be found on fores.se for those of you who wants to read more of the policy recommendations from the book. I think our panelists, I would like to welcome you into our discussions. We have Catherine Woolard, who is the Director and Secretary General of ECRE, the European Council of Refugee and Exiles. Welcome, Catherine. We have Rebecca Stern, who is the Professor of Public International Law at the Faculty of Law at the Uppsala University here in Sweden. Welcome, Rebecca. And we have Jan-Christoph Oetjen, member of the EU Parliament for Germany, and also a member of the Renew Europe group in the Parliament. Welcome, Jan-Christoph. I'm so glad that you could all join us. We were also expecting to have Mr. Malik Azmani joining us today, but unfortunately had some last-minute changes to his schedule, and for that reason he has been unable to attend. You're all very involved in the Common European Asylum System, both as it is, but also what it is proposed to be, but you come from very different perspectives. So I'm really glad that you could all join us today. Welcome. Thank you. Before we get started with some questions, you have received the study and perhaps had a chance to look at it beforehand, and also now you listened to Bernd's presentation. Could I please ask you just to make a short comment on what Bernd has found? If we could start with you, Rebecca.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to comment on this really interesting and timely book. I don't think you could be more in the moment than you are right now. I've of course got lots of reflections about both about the book and some of the conclusions and suggestions you have. But one of the reflections I had reading it, looking at the development of the CEAS and the current situation and the proposals of the Migration Pact, is the shift in balance you see between the interests, the weight accorded to the interests of states compared to the weight accorded to the interests and rights of individuals. Earlier, the rights and interests of migrants were at least more at the forefront than what is the case today, when the main focus now seems to be on increased control of borders, control of migrants, control of migrant movements, and also on what would be the most effective measures to take from a state perspective. That is the focus. So what we see, and this is of course nothing new, but it's becoming increasingly clear that looking at migration and asylum from a rights-based perspective is not really a key ingredient anymore. That's the impression I get. And one example of these are the suggestions of a fast-track border procedure, which might lead to that the principle of non-refoulement is not thoroughly respected or not properly respected, and also the increased focus on obligations for asylum seekers, including sanctions, as you mentioned in the report, Bernd. I also think there's also an increased focus on efficiency and for the procedures to be effective rather than actually taking all interests into account. And as for looking to the future, I think one of the key elements, and this you also spoke about, Bernd, is the focus on exploring the possibilities of legal pathways. I think if we could crack that nut, if we could solve that question, I think a lot of the issues of the Common European Asylum System would be solved. Having that said, it's one of the most difficult parts to address as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You please comment and make some small reflections on what you've heard on the study itself.
Thank you, Therese. I assume you were asking me. We lost you a bit.
Sorry.
But
yeah, sure. Yeah, it's the internet. Yes, Catherine, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. So from my side, I found this report extremely useful, and what I like is the approach. I think when you have an area of policy which is both dysfunctional and conflictual, breaking it down piece by piece is a helpful way to tackle the issue. And you have to build solutions by reconstructing piece by piece, rather than proposing unrealistic, grandiose solutions. The only element missing for me from the problem analysis was the interplay with the wider rule of law question, because I think the extent to which undemocratic and illiberal governments in Europe exploit this issue is a factor. In terms of your scenarios, I found this particularly rich. Your scenario number 3, from our perspective, is the key to all of this: harmonization within Europe. And this requires a reform of policy and practice to focus on this instead of trying to focus on what Europe makes other regions do, instead looking at what needs to be done within Europe. In terms of your scenario 2, responsibility sharing, on that I'm afraid quite pessimistic. I think there's very little chance to have an improved legal framework. The solutions will rest in terms of formalizing some of the ad hoc options and moving towards a more rights-based implementation of the current rules. Finally, scenario 3, legal entry is key. Everybody agrees it's key, but how do we increase the numbers? For the asylum piece, it has to be clear that this is not a substitute for allowing people to enter at borders. When it comes to non-asylum migration, I think the key is pressure from outside. And here there's great potential, particularly in Africa, for countries to be working collectively and through the African Union and other regional bodies to put pressure on Europe to increase the numbers. And sometimes the power that those countries have is not always recognized. So we're, for instance, working with civil society in Africa on some of that. The only additional element I would put in your reform scenarios is perhaps a point 4 on inclusion and integration within Europe, because this does relate to the responsibility sharing issues and the absolutely parlous situation in certain countries when it comes to inclusion through respecting the rights of beneficiaries of international protection, as well as those with other statuses or more troubling and difficult statuses. It is an area which is not part of, it's not an EU competence, but there's a huge amount the EU can do, which is sometimes overlooked. Thank you.
It's also mentioned in the book of that this also causes the chances and the opportunities in the society where you end up. It causes subsequent movement in Europe, which of course is also something that needs to be addressed. Thank you so much, Catherine. And hopefully, Jan-Christoph, do you have some comments from your part as well?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me and for presenting us this very interesting and helpful study. The name is already the key pieces of the puzzle, and Catherine said just rightly that I mean, deconstructing the actual situation is the only thing we can do to move forward, because if you look at the mountain that represents the dysfunction of the European Common Asylum System, you can only go step by step and piece by piece. It's like a puzzle of 1,000 pieces, where you have to start somewhere and try to construct something. So from my point of view, your study, Bernd, is very, very helpful. And I agree with you that legal entry pathways are one of the most important points. That concerns protection and the question of resettlement, etc. But this concerns as well legal pathways for labor migration. And this is a lack in Europe. We don't have a common system on legal migration. All those people wanting to build a better future for themselves and for their families, they come to Europe because they want to work, and they have no other solutions than taking the same routes as people fleeing, as you described, those mixed migration that brings us so many problems. So we need a European system as well for labor migration, and the proposal from the Commission is not ambitious enough on this issue, to be very clear. I mean, you can do a holistic attempt as you describe the Commission proposal, but it's not holistic if you don't take into account labor migration, which is a very, very important piece of the puzzle. We are, as policymakers, a little bit caught in a situation where there are things we would like to do and others that are, let's say, how we are able to find a majority within the member states and in the European Parliament. And this is a very, very difficult situation. So going ahead step by step and taking into account important measures, because the situation is not good. I mean, Rebecca said that there's a shift in the European asylum policy. Yeah, but the situation as it is today is not possible to. I mean, it's not acceptable neither. I mean, look at Greece and look at how it works at the moment in Italy. So we have to kind of do something in order to have a better and harmonized European system, where the European Union looks at what the member states are doing and tries to help migrants to be in a better situation. Then that concerns housing, that concerns legal options, and from my point of view, this is something where we have to look at carefully, because, as Rebecca said, there is a possibility that the pact brings us less rights for migrants, and we have to put in safeguards when we discuss it on a political level in order to ensure that all rights that asylum seekers have are truly true safeguards for asylum seekers in order not to lose their rights in a border procedure or in a pre-screening at the border.
And from what I hear from all of you, the individual is something that you are highlighting in a kind of missing or lacking that perspective in the pact as presented. And I know also that, Jan-Christoph, that you put out a paper in January already from the Renew group where labor migration was highlighted, or legal entry pathways was highlighted, and that it was maybe not completely fulfilled now in the pact as presented, that you find that it's still missing. However, if we just stop for a minute in looking forward and look at what's right now, because we actually already have a common European asylum system today. In whether or not it's functioning or not, we don't know. But Catherine, could you just give your perspective? Is there a compliance with the rules today? What is the consensus today on migration issues? I know everybody knows that it's not working, but where do we stand? Because we are talking about something that should function.
I think when we assess the current situation, from our perspective, there are 4 or 5 key implementation gaps that need to be addressed, and many of them are covered in Bernth's useful study. And this includes totally inadequate reception conditions, a lack of registration, the poor quality of decision making, which leads to the so-called asylum lottery, and the absence of procedural guarantees that are there not as a special luxury, but to make sure that people's rights are respected during processes. So they're not an optional add-on, they're currently part of the framework. And then finally, we also refer to implementation gaps when it comes to the implementation of Dublin. And if the actual hierarchy was respected, we would see far more effort, energy, and outcomes when it comes to family reunion, which should be, which is the first of the criteria, rather than this focus on take-back requests. So there's a whole set of areas where improvements could be made through adequate resources being allocated and through a role of the European Commission in monitoring, evaluating, insisting and launching infringement procedures where necessary. I think when we have this debate, we have to be wary about saying things are not working, therefore they can never work. And that's not an adequate policy response. Just because there are challenges, you don't abandon the whole idea of having policy in this area. There's a legal framework. As with any other area of EU law, there should be compliance with that legal framework and consequences for a lack of compliance. And that involves addressing problems before we have to go to courts and get the judgments there.
So there is a compliance issue, but is there also a legal issue if we talk about, if we just stop for a minute at the responsibility sharing mechanisms that, to be truthful, is not that changed in the pact. It's more or less the same with some additional parts. Rebecca, do you think that there are any legal problems, or is it just a matter of compliance and political will with the system today?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, of course, but I can only echo Catherine in saying that the main problem would be the implementation gaps and the lack of compliance. There are points to saying, there is a point to the critique against the Dublin system, in particular in relation to the states in Southern Europe. But like, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, you have a system, and if states would show the political will to actually try to follow the rules that we have set up so far, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are. My fear in the current situation is that if we keep the current system, the states that have complied fairly well so far will continue to try to find what they can do the least and still get away with, as has been the case somewhat in Sweden, when we try to look at minimum standards and saying that a certain level will be the EU minimum standard, whilst this actually is not. So perhaps you need to take a broader approach into solving some of the issues, but I think it's at the heart of it, the main problem is not a legal problem, it's a political problem. Thanks.
And we end up again in a political will, which is your area, Jan-Christoph, and the suggestions made by Bernd in maybe it's time to leave some countries behind. Maybe it's time for some countries to lead the way and create a fully harmonized asylum system, irrespective of the Dublin and the responsibility sharing, but harmonized the asylum procedure. Is that something that is discussed as to the political will? Is it even mentioned that it would be a possibility to sort of move in different speeds?
Well, not yet, Therese. But let me first come to the question of implementation. From my point of view, this is the true problem of the European asylum system. I mean, even the proposal now from the Commission, I mean, it looks, even if you agree that it looks fine on paper, I mean, how will it be in reality? And that's the big issue. And I mean, we are progressives and we have a people-centered approach. So if you look at the migrant and who's arriving in Europe at the European border, what's his procedure? What's his procedure? How does it work out for him or for her? That's from my point of view. That's the question. And if you look at what's written on the on the paper, that might be fine, because from my point of view, effectiveness and taking all interest into account is nothing that you can oppose. You can do both of them. But it's a question if it works, if it's truly and well implemented. About the proposal of different speeds, for me, this is an option if the approach of the Commission does not work out. I mean, we have already countries giving the lead. To be clear, I mean, look at what has been agreed in Valletta when there were people in distress in the Mediterranean. You see, there were some countries accepting to take migrants to the countries, and others were not. So there are countries showing the lead, and from my point of view, it would be an option. If this does not work out in the whole European Union, to create, let's say, a European asylum area like the Schengen area, and have a European asylum area with truly harmonized, a truly harmonized asylum system with similar procedures, without asylum lottery, and let's say a coordinated and harmonized way of doing things, of housing people, of giving them access to social security, giving them access to the labor market, etc. These would be, from my point of view, an option if this does not work out on the European level with the approach of the Commission. But I would prefer, to be very clear, to have a truly European system. I mean, we are in the European Union because we want to do things together, and so this option to have different speeds is just second best. Thanks.
Thank you. And we fully agree, although we don't want it to be compromised too far as to the individual's right when we try to find a common, all European countries and member states participating. Our time has actually run out. We've had some technical difficulties, and I apologize if the viewer has noticed that. We have noticed it a little bit on our part, at least. It's always like that in this time of age. I just want to still, although we are a few minutes past, if you could all just give me one ingredient for us to move next step in the right direction in harmonizing and getting that beautiful picture that Jan-Christoph now mentioned, a harmonized European system. Catherine, do you want to start with just your ingredient?
So I'm going to add two. One is compliance. And the second one is allowing non-state actors to operate. And by non-state, I also include other layers of government beyond central government. And these are the positive forces when it comes to making asylum work in Europe and supporting inclusion of the whole variety of different migrants. And if there's a crackdown on these actors, or if they're not allowed to fulfill their potential, then the situation will be far worse.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Rebecca, your ingredient?
I'll be very brief. I think I've already said it. It's the political will.
Yeah.
You need the political will for the system to work. You can have any kind of legal system that will look brilliant on paper, without the political will to apply it, nothing will happen. So that's the ingredient.
My ingredient is calm, because every time when migration is high at the head of the newspapers, that only helps the far right, and it makes difficult to have a reason-based discussion on asylum and migration. So calm would be the most important thing, and we have to have a situation where I mean it's not difficult to have migration politics. So it's just something normal to discuss, and migration is something normal which happened all the time during humanity. So we need calm to be able to have compromises.
Thank you. Bernd, you get the final ingredients in this.
Yeah, I mean, Catherine and Rebecca and Jan-Christoph mentioned really good points, and I don't know if I have anything so much more to add, but sometimes I'm very pessimistic about what we are doing, but I think we have to get away from dealing with migration as an emergency. It has to, in that sense, I agree very much with when you say that we have to be a bit calm on this, and I like the message from Ylva Johansson when she said that we have to accept migration as something normal. But I would say just normal is perhaps not good enough as a vision. Perhaps we should be a little bit more ambitious or more positive about what the central message is, what we want to do with migration. But well, I don't have the ideal solution.
Ingredient. Maybe it's a combination of many. I want to thank you all so much, and I apologize again for a little Wi-Fi hiccup here and there, and I hope you have, as a viewer, also been able to follow the discussion despite of that. I thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to our panelists. It's been a pleasure to hear what you have had to say about this study, and especially thank you to you, Bernd, for us, both the policy brief and the book, where you can also order it on forest.se. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.